I was the leader in my church's youth group, and a new girl was at her first year of summer camp. One night, she noticed other girls dressing up for chapel and asked them why. From across the room, a senior yells, "On Thursday nights, we get dressed up and we cry."
Damn, I'm glad I didn't peek in high school, 'cause my best days will be in the past. I know, looking back, it ain't all bad, but damn, I'm glad I didn't peek in high school.
Hey everyone, welcome to Unlearning Youth Group. We're the podcast where we take a look at all the things we learned back in youth group. We find the good, we unlearn the bad, and we figure out where the heck we go from here. If we haven't met, my name is Jonathan Caron, and we are joined as always by our co-host, Mr. Eric Williams. Eric, can you go ahead and say hey to the people?
What is up, people? Ready to get into the topic today.
This is episode 2 of season 2, and today we are talking about, it's a topic that Eric had that I really like the idea of, and it's the idea that as leaders, we projected our struggle on everyone else. Mm-hmm. And you've probably been in a church or in a ministry where one type of sin was elevated so much higher than everything else. That was the big sin. That was the thing that we all had to avoid. And it was usually because the leader, whether it was the main leader or in youth group, maybe in your small group leader, that was their struggle.
Right.
Eric, you have a great example of this that can kind of help people understand it with some churches that you were on staff at. So can you go ahead and let the people know what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I mean, Jonathan and I were both, we have marketing backgrounds here. And so, you know, it's pretty well known in marketing that every person, every human being is going to filter information through their own personal perspective. So some of this is just natural, but in general, it's like whatever your experience is, whatever the situation that you're facing, now that becomes elevated in your mind as a leader. So 2 churches in particular that I worked for, both big mega churches. One church was they were very big on dealing with sexual sin and the appropriate relationships between staff, because early on in their ministry, they had some high level people that were having problems with that. Let's just say they also were consulting with another church that was in the same boat, where this other church like removed all the doors from all the offices just to make sure that people weren't, having issues and stuff like that. So like as a staff, we literally had 10 commandments. They were the 10 commandments that we had for the staff. And all 10 commandments had to do with interactions with the opposite sex, whether you were married or not married. So we had to sign basically this covenant that said how we were going to act with that. Other issues like, for instance, like alcohol, no big deal. You could have a Bible study at a brewery. You could do all that kind of stuff. You could smoke cigars with the dudes, no big deal. But sexual sin, it was to the point that like if you were in a car with, like if you had to give anybody a ride that wasn't your spouse or, sister or mom or whatever like that, like you'd be fired, like just no questions asked, just gone, right? It was that serious, no matter the circumstance. Fast forward, different church that I worked at was almost like the exact opposite. The leadership had some dealings with either their family or other people that were alcoholics. So alcohol was a big thing. The denomination they came from was kind of already set against alcohol in general. So as staff, we had to sign a covenant that said that we would not consume alcohol. And if we did, we would be fired. Now, did they have 10 huge commandments on how to interact with members of the opposite sex? No, it was like one passing thing that said, hey, make sure that you're being appropriate with the opposite sex. But other than that, it was like alcohol was a strict no. You couldn't talk about it. It was a big deal. And so both of those situations came because of the personal struggles or the struggles that were in and around the leadership. And it was interesting looking at it from the outside, seeing that, is sexual sin a problem? Yes. Is abusing alcohol or other substances like that a problem? Yes. Were they given 2 completely different emphasis, depending on the church and the background of the church leaders? Yes. And so how does that filter down into our experiences, either going through youth group or being church attendees now?
And an example of that, to bring it back to youth group, was I know of youth leaders. So one guy, he had like you mentioned, he had struggled with alcohol, and so his big thing to the guys in his small group was to stay away from alcohol, stay away from alcohol, stay away from alcohol. It's the worst, it's the worst, it's the worst. And people, that's what his small group thought the gospel was
Right.
just stay away from alcohol. I know another small group leader, a girl. She was probably 30, 32 at the time, but she had had a lot of bad dating relationships in her 20s. So because she had made mistakes, because she had dated guys that were jerks, guys that treated her terribly, she told her girls they don't need to start dating until they're in their late 20s. It's not. There's no use in dating in high school. There's no use in dating in college or in your 20s. Just wait till you're older and be done with it. There's not really a Christian biblical basis for that, but that was her perspective based on her experiences. So she projected that onto her students. And it's an easy thing to do. I have my issues. Like, I talk a lot about a porn addiction I had in my 20s after a breakup. I talk a lot about other stuff, depression, because those are my two examples like that I have lived through and I can talk about. So it's easy for me to take every single topic to that because I know it can go there. But not every person is wired the same. You have different struggles and temptations and trigger points than I do, and I have different ones than you. So if I'm only talking about mine, then you're never going to connect or see how the gospel is relevant to your life if I'm only talking about how it's relevant to mine.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we have another episode from season 1 that talks a little bit. It's going to dive a little bit more into the differences between sins for different people. But this is specifically, so I mean, if you want to dig into that, you can go back and see in season 1. But specifically, this is very important to look through and how our faith as adults was shaped based on that type of leading that we received. And so it's for sure. I mean, I think, you put it in our notes that you make it into the boogeyman sometimes, this particular sin or this particular issue. And I mean, I think it's true where like you create this culture where that this youth group is like, oh, at this youth group, they don't listen to secular music. Oh, at this youth group. So now all of a sudden you've become this and put it into something more as an adult that now starts to really taint the way that you look at some of these issues that can become sin, but may or may not be sin on their own. So, as you talk about with our podcast every time, we don't just want to just rag on it, but we talk about what's good, what's bad, and where we go from here. So what were some of the other things that were bad about or are bad about this projection from our own perspective thing?
So a lot of times what happens is it can lead to a bad theology or a bad biblical application. Because we think drinking is wrong. If you look at a lot of churches where they're totalitarian, that all alcohol is wrong. Independent fundamental Baptists, a lot in there. A lot of that comes down to at some point in their history, the people who are attracted to that theology were impacted by drunk driving, killing somebody, or an alcoholic family member who treated people terribly.
Yep.
And because of the sin of those people, they go and find verses in the Bible to justify that.
Right.
The same thing we're seeing now politically in both sides of the political aisle, that we're taking our personal, emotional, or political bent, and we're projecting that onto everything and then using scripture to find the basis for that, as opposed to reading the scripture and finding things based on what it says. We're doing it backwards. And a lot of times, like, the reason this is called Unlearning Youth Group is because there is a movement amongst people our age, the ex-evangelical crowd, where people are trying to unlearn things that were taught to them that they didn't learn themselves.
Right.
Because they allowed these ideas where people would elevate or project their own issues And that's the version of the gospel they learn, as opposed to reading the Bible for themselves and discovering what the Bible actually says, so that you can create an accurate theology of who God is and what he wants us to do.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the political side, and obviously we try to be careful around some of that, especially with the temperature politically in our country.
And because I'm running for city council right now.
Yeah, well, that's also
so
that's
there's
true
that.
But let's political parties aside. Haven't you noticed that whether it's in politics, or I think this is kind of close to home for your alma mater, but the people, the leaders, the Christian leaders that are the most against certain things. Wow, doesn't that seem like years down the road, it turns out that they actually struggle with that, or they were using it as a defense for something else. And so you've got these like family values pastors that end up being caught in sexual sin. You've got, these people that are blatantly homophobic or anti-LGBTQ. And then there's something that comes out about them that they're, trying to defend whatever. And like, there's just these things about, same thing with alcoholism or other stuff like that, or gambling, where they're against it on the outside. They're part of the quote unquote moral majority, but then it turns out in their personal life, they're really saying that because they're defending the behavior that they're engaging in, that they say that they detest.
Or they're trying to protect themselves so heavily,
correct,
that they think everyone else has to protect themselves that much. Gambling is not something I struggle with.
Right.
So like the people who always speak against it, which that's part of a church, especially in now that sports gambling is getting more and more legalized, you see people like making it a boogeyman, and they're biblical. Don't get me wrong. There are biblical things to say that you shouldn't do a lot of that stuff. But when we elevate it so high, one example I like to give is, did you go through DARE when you were in school?
Yep.
Okay. What does DARE stand for? Drug
abuse resistance education or something like that.
There you go.
And then we also, in middle school, we had GREAT, gang resistance education and training.
Okay. We didn't have that, but we live in a little small town. We didn't have gangs. So there's that. But I've heard a lot of people like DARE, it was their introduction to drugs.
Drugs, yeah, exactly.
Because there was such an emphasis put on saying no to drugs, that it actually made them interested in drugs.
Yeah.
And so when we project our issues, the thing that we struggle with, a lot of times it's sexual sin. And a lot of times, because sexual sin is an issue.
Right.
Next episode, we're actually talking about sexualizing things. So we'll dive into that more next week. But when you start talking about something over and over and over, it gives people, especially teenagers, the idea of, you know what, man, I want to go try that.
Right.
So I can see what they're talking about, because they made it sound fun.
Oh, yeah. Well, and then you get like the youth pastor guy, which, again, I was youth pastor guy. So I'm but they're up there, they're like, all right, guys, do you know that you can access any type of porn you want right here on this cell phone? And you're like, oh,
really?
Okay. You're like, yeah, for free. Oh, all right. You know what I mean? And
I didn't know it was that easy, Eric.
Or they're talking through it on like, and some of you are going into your parents' liquor cabinet and sneaking alcohol. And they're like, oh, I didn't even think to do that. You know what I mean? Or whatever else it is. It's like they're talking against it, or even like, again, we're going to talk about sexualizing later, but it's like some of you, and then they just keep talking about sexualized stuff. You're looking at this, you're looking at that, and your sister in Christ is wearing this. And now all of a sudden guys
my wife's so smoking hot and I'm so glad I get to have sex with her.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so those things, they end up becoming earworms, so to speak, in your brain. And and it can do that, and it really just becomes something that, again, these churches or these, our faith is built around these signature sins that somehow become worse than any other sin around, instead of really understanding that anything that's done that becomes an idol can become a sin, right? So anything in your life that you're doing. And that's why, like, if you see it a lot of times of people that are in recovery, they end up switching their addiction from one thing to another. And so rather than becoming an alcoholic, now I'm like super fitness guy. I'm just addicted to fitness and I'm addicted to working out. Okay, well, you just shifted your addiction. Maybe it's something that like morally is more healthy, but you still have a different signature issue. And because you haven't fixed that culture that's built around it and saying, hey, what is wise for me, instead of what's right or wrong.
Yeah. So I'm going to quote something here, and it is by a guy who, if he said it today, I would not quote him. But at the time,
Sure.
he was good. His name starts with R and rhymes with Bob.
Okay.
And his last name is something you hear. Churches used to have these in their towers. So what he said was, whatever it is that hooks in you, you will never be free from it until you find something that you want more.
Yep.
It's not about getting rid of the desire. It's about giving ourselves to bigger and better and more powerful desires. And that's something, it's a quote that I think about a lot, especially when it comes to these big capital S sins. We talk about them so much because the desire in us still exists.
Yep.
And the desire to drink still exists in the alcoholics inside in their emotions. So they talk about
or whatever it is that they're trying to get out of that alcohol, right? Is it the desire to disassociate, the desire to not feel? There's a desire in there. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So whatever that desire is, the reason that we elevate these things so highly is because that desire never goes away. Like, we have to unlearn it and repackage it and give it to God. And a lot of times the people who are leading youth groups, whether it is the youth pastor who is just out of college, or it is the youth leader who is a volunteer, a lot of times they're just coming off of some type of struggle, and getting through that is what has motivated them to help keep other kids from having to go through that. Yeah. And because it's still so top of mind, it feels the desire is still there. So they have to talk about it more and more because they don't want you to go. So from a perspective, like, they're doing it to help you. They don't want you to go through the things that they went through. They don't want you to deal with the struggle they went through. So they're trying to get you to a place that you're not going to experience that. But in the process, they actually go too far and introduce you to that struggle when maybe you didn't think about it before.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's spot on. Like, I heard a passion talk from Ben Stewart, who's the lead pastor at Passion City Church in DC. And he said something very similar. And I'll never forget, he brought up a fishing lure on stage. And he's talked about how our attention goes after these things, and then we end up chasing these things because we obsess over them. And it's like, until you're lured or it's replaced by something better, which ultimately, he's talking about the beauty and the wonder and the great of Jesus. But, he said, and the other problem is, like, this thing wiggles in front of you. Maybe it's a little worm or it's like a little frog. And somebody goes, "Oh, frogs do it to you, you sicko." You know what I mean? Like, we end up looking at other people's temptations like, ugh, gosh, how could you like that? That's gross. You're just disgusting. And it's like, but meanwhile, we've got there's something else in us that we want to pursue, that we're going after, that, like, instead of backing away and going, all right, how can we approach this in a positive way?
Yeah. I'm not going to be tempted by alcohol. That's not my struggle. I've never drank in my life because I know I can't. And so if that's not going to be, I have family members who, if it's around, they're going to drink too much.
Right.
And so their temptation is not my temptation. So as we talk about it, if I never talked about alcohol, then I would do them a disservice. But if I only talked about alcohol, I would also do them a disservice. Yep. And you can, like, we've used a couple generic things here, but you can fill in the blank. I'm sure you've been in places where you hear, like, the church that I go to now, we emphasize church unity a ton and clearing the air with people who you may have an issue with, because 4, 5, 6 years ago, there was almost a church split. The church almost died, and there was some infighting and stuff like that. So one of the reasons that is emphasized is because we don't want to go through that again. And they do it in a healthy way, but just knowing, like, given the ability to spot these things, I knew it's like, oh, that's in that story. Somewhere in the church's story, there was that. I found out since I first heard about it what the story is, but everyone has that thing that they want to protect against. Yeah, exactly. And it's healthy. It's healthy to want to protect people from things, especially harmful things. We just have to make sure we're not protecting them in a way that also ends up hurting them.
Yeah, it's that pendulum swing, right? Because like in your example there, it's like church unity is good, but then it turns into like loyalty, which is also kind of good. And then it turns into like obsessive loyalty, or it turns into devotion at all costs.
Did
which
you
is
listen
not
to
good.
the Mars Hill podcast, The
Oh,
Rise and
yeah.
Fall? Okay.
Mhm.
So if you're listening to us today and you have any inkling of desire to hear about like how good churches go bad,
Yep.
that The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill from Christianity Today is an incredible podcast. But one of the things they talked about was things got to the point where if you questioned anything, you were basically shunned.
Right.
Church unity became church, like you said a word a second ago that spurned that, but like it was almost toxic. Actually, it was toxic. It was like it was manipulating, and what was good, what started as a protection, ended up going bad.
Yeah, it becomes devotion. It becomes compliance. It becomes all those things that are bad. And I mean, like, I've had experiences working at churches where it was like that. Like one of the first churches I worked at, just like you talked about the story, very early on, there was a split between the two main elders, and one of the elders left and planted his own church. And so then for a period of about 15 years, they basically said, hey, anyone who talks about church planting is going to get fired. You just knew it. Like if you talked about planting a church, no matter what, you were going to get fired. If you talked about going to work for another church or leaving the church to work for something else, you were shunned. And then, I mean, luckily that church flipped around and said, okay, obviously planting new churches is one of the best ways to get more people and spread the gospel and blah, blah, blah. So they've turned the other way. But how many people have been on church staff or in volunteer positions where it's that same thing, where it's like, if you question anything or, anything else like that. So that's where that church unity and loyalty goes from being a good quality to being an obsessive focus.
Weaponized.
That's now weaponized as a different sin issue.
And using our stories is a good thing.
Right.
Using our stories to reach people and being able to relate to students or others in our life and in a way that we can share the gospel and how Jesus changed our life, that is a good thing.
Yep. And the good heart behind it too is like, learn from my mistakes so you don't have to make them. So exactly.
Let me pay the dumb tax. That's a word my old pastor used to say. Let me pay the dumb tax so that you don't have to experience it. And so that's a good thing. Showing people there are consequences to sin, that is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's just when we elevate it too far, it can become bad.
Yeah.
So as we think about leading our kids, that's a big motivation for our podcast, is where do we go from here? What's next? How do we take these bad approaches, the good intentions of the bad approaches, and make them better for the next generation? So whether it's raising our kids or it's if we become youth leaders again at some point, how do we move forward in a positive way so that we don't actually do this to people in the future?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is this: I'm going to talk to people that are in church leadership, because I've consulted with people in church leadership, just like you have. I've worked with in churches, and I would say, like,
hey, strangely enough, this is a fun part about this podcast. I didn't expect this, but the most response we got from season 1 were from people currently in church leadership, who are student pastors now or have gone on to other things in ministry because they see themselves who have done this. So you're speaking to our audience right here.
So here you go. You have to listen to and get to know people and what they're actually dealing with. And that requires a diversity of perspectives, right? So I had a lead pastor one time that said, you need to get a variety of voices around the room. So church leaders, if you're volunteer teams, if you're groups, if you're leadership teams, if you're teaching team, if you're whatever, if they look like you, if they sound like you, and if they struggle like you, you're not diverse enough. You need to have perspectives from a variety of different places. So that way, when something gets brought up and somebody says, well, let's talk about anxiety and mental health. I've literally been in rooms like this, and they go, that's not a big deal. And then you have somebody in the corner that's willing to say, hey, I've struggled with anxiety my entire life, and I struggle with the sin associated with it and trying to figure out how to, go through where fear stops, where worry stops. And now it's like you just see this whole room of people change their minds because of one person's perspective. And so if you don't have a diversity of perspectives in that room, you're going to continue to create these cultural silos and these giant sin issues that may or may not actually impact the people that are around you. So that would be number one. I would say two is like, if you're in church leadership and you have a legalistic view of your struggles, that's something you need to deal with. And I'm encouraging everyone, talk to a professional about it. I think that we need to kind of deconstruct this idea that pastoral counseling from the pastors that we work for is the only way to go. Because sometimes you have to break out of the culture and go see, a licensed professional counselor. Yeah, that is a Christian counselor. I agree. But someone that's outside of that perspective to help you get a healthy perspective on the types of things that you're talking about, the types of things that you're struggling with, and how you're leading people through that. On the flip side too, if you've become what I would say a victim, or if you carry triggering events from somebody who's done that to you, and you say, man, maybe I have an unhealthy view of sex and purity. Maybe I have an unhealthy view of alcohol. Maybe I have an unhealthy view of secular, insert whatever media you have here. Talk to somebody about it, because it's probably affecting other areas of life. And for parents, it's definitely affecting how you raise your kids.
Absolutely. And on that front, I would say own your issues,
Yep.
but don't give them to your kids,
Right.
whether those kids be your biological children or the students that you're leading. For example, this is an easy one for me. I'm fat. Like, I just am. Like, we could get into the behind it, but I'm overweight. It is what it is. I could project my body issues and the issues that I face with being fat onto my kids. I could say, no, don't eat that because you're going to get fat. Or I could say, you need to go exercise so that you don't get fat. Or all of these other things. They're 4 and 6.
Right.
Like, we're trying to build healthy systems and healthy habits, but we have to own our issues, but we can't project them, because how many times does generational sin or generational issues happen because parents project the things that they dealt with onto their children over and over and over, and the cycle keeps going. So if my kids end up struggling with things that I struggled with, then I have the opportunity to speak into that because I've been there and I've struggled with it. But I don't want to push those same things on them when they don't have to go through them.
Exactly. And that's why I tell you, you've talked about TikTok before. That's why I love TikTok, because I get to see people's experiences that I would have never thought about. And so, like, just going along with what you said, one of the things that I'm seeing is like all of these, especially women who are asking, saying, hey, when was the first time that you started to hate your body? And most of the time it's stories about how a grandmother said, oh, you shouldn't eat that because you're going to get fat, or you got to stop eating this because you're going to do this. And it's like, man, that just puts into my mind how important it is for us not to project our own sins, or not to project in the effort to protect. We shouldn't be projecting some of these problems onto our kids. And how can we handle it in a healthy way, in a grace-filled way, in a way that helps kids understand, sin is sin, and there are problems with sin, but sin is not something you should be afraid of. Because if you're afraid of sin, or if you're afraid of those sin issue things, then what does that say about your Savior?
Yes. And it's a fine line there. There's a very fine line of doing that. And one of the things I want to say, like, plainly, is we're going to get it wrong. Like, we can't just look at the generation before us and say, no, you screwed up. You did this so wrong. You shouldn't have done it that way. Right. We're going to get it wrong. We've joked on here before that 20 years from now, our kids are going to be doing a podcast on unlearning all the things that we unlearned, so that they can do things better as well. And I think that's part of growing up. That's part of leading anything. And so we're going to mess this up. We're going to struggle, but I want us to be able to struggle together so that we can struggle in a positive way for positive progress. And that's what this whole podcast is about.
And part of that is just understanding, going all the way back to the beginning of the topic, is that we all struggle with things and we struggle with things differently. And so the advice that you give, it's great advice, but just remember, whatever you're talking about doesn't have to be the most important thing. And so if you're making that advice, if you're making that sin, if you're making that, hey, like you talked about, when I was in my 20s, I dated a bunch of bad guys. Great. It's good advice to say, be very discerning who you're going to date and who you're going to be involved with and when, but it doesn't mean it has to be the ultimate bit of advice to say, don't date in your 20s. So let's have a bit of perspective and understanding and empathizing with the people around us so that we could really say, the issue is I want the best for you, not I want you to avoid alcohol, or not I want you to avoid this issue, because that's where we get it mixed up. Instead of looking at, I want you to have the best overall life that Jesus has called you to, instead of you just need to avoid X, Y, and Z, because that doesn't create sustainable relationship with Jesus.
It's, hey, I struggled with this and I don't want you to.
Yeah.
So use this as a guardrail. We talk about the guardrail idea in our Wise versus Right episode last season.
Yep.
But we don't want to put them in the position so that they'll absolutely 100% go through it as well. Because just using the dating example, if we constantly harp on the bad relationships we had in our 20s, then the people we're leading, whether it's our kids or our students, they're going to go into every relationship that they have from a dating perspective looking for those things. So instead of working through things that can be worked through, I'm not talking about the toxic things that need to be run from, just the little issues that come with maturity and building a relationship. Instead of working through those to create a healthy relationship, they're just going to run because we told them they need to run at the first sign of a red flag.
Yep, exactly.
So that is it for today. Next week, it seems like week 3 of the season is our sex week. So we're going to hit up.
Just like Cry Nights Thursday night.
Week 3 is always going to be about that. Maybe not in the future. But next week, we're talking about how we sexualized everything in youth group. Everything was way too over-sexualized, and it gave us the wrong perspective of sex, of body issues, of how we handle our own temptations. And we'll dive more into that next week. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe to the show, rate us, review us wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd love to hear your feedback on Instagram. I'm Jonathan_Carone. Eric, you are Eric W712.
Yep, that's right.
I got it right finally. So Eric W712 on Instagram for Eric. We would love to hear back from you. Share this with a friend if it resonated with you. That's it for this week. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you for episode 3 next week.
Damn, I'm glad I ain't leaking high school. 'Cause my best days will be